It's 10:30 on the 21st of June, and 2 days later than planned, Westminster is all set to hear the Queen's speech in one of the most uncertain periods in British politics for decades. So stay with us for the state opening of Parliament. Very good morning from Westminster. Lovely sunny day. Who knows what the day will bring? It's the start of a brand new session of Parliament. A hung Parliament, of course, following the recent election when the Conservatives lost their majority in the House of Commons. And the Queen's...
This is BBC News. I'm Simon McCoy, live from Westminster on the day the Queen sets out the government's plans in her speech to Parliament. This year's Queen's speech, which covers a 2-year period instead of the usual 1 year, finally went ahead after it was postponed following the Grenfell Tower block fire. The main focus of the government's plans was Brexit, with the announcement of other proposals covering rental fees, domestic violence and car insurance. We'll bring you much more on that in the next few minutes. But first, just before the state opening of Parliament, Buckingham Palace issued a statement that the Duke of Edinburgh has been admitted to hospital as a precautionary measure. The Duke is to receive treatment for an infection arising from what officials called a pre-existing condition. Our correspondent Lisa Hampley is outside the King Edward VII Hospital in central London, where the Duke of Edinburgh is being...
inside her own party and also across Parliament if she has any chance of getting her plans through and staying in office. But of course, actions speak much louder than words.
Indeed. Thank you all for coming. Joanna and Yvette and Brandon and Laura, of course. Really good to have you with us today as we look at the new look, if you like, a new look state opening of Parliament. Thanks to all of you coming in. Thanks for watching, of course. Coverage of the debate on the Queen's speech, and it's going to be a pretty lively one, will continue on the BBC News channel this afternoon. State opening of Parliament is concluded, but will it really be 2 years before the next one? It's a time of immense political challenge ahead. From all of the BBC team here at Westminster, thanks for watching and goodbye.
This is BBC News. I'm Simon McCoy, live from Westminster on the day the Queen sets out the government's plans in her speech to Parliament. This year's Queen's speech, which covers a 2-year period instead of the usual 1 year.
Hello, good afternoon. This is BBC Newsroom Live with me, Jullian Worricker. More from Simon in a moment at Westminster, but first the latest headlines for you. The government has set out a range of measures it hopes to bring into law over the next 2 years, with Brexit at the top of the agenda. The Queen said her government was committed to building the widest possible consensus on the country's future outside of the EU. New measures on immigration and agriculture were included, but other pledges in the Conservative manifesto were altered after the party failed to get a majority in the snap general election. The Duke of Edinburgh was admitted to hospital last night as a precautionary measure, Buckingham Palace has said. Policing in England and Wales could be at significant risk if resources are diverted to fight terrorism, the UK's top counter-terrorism officer has said. A man suspected of setting off a bomb at Brussels Central Station yesterday has been identified as a 36-year-old Moroccan. Officials say he was carrying a bomb armed with nails and gas canisters. Oscar-winning actor Sir Daniel Day-Lewis, who starred in Gangs of New York and Last of the Mohicans, has retired. A charity single to raise money for those affected by the Grenfell Tower fire has been released. More than 50 stars recorded Bridge Over Troubled Water to support victims' families and survivors.
let's get more now on our coverage from here in Westminster on the Queen's speech. One of the things not in her speech was the expected state visit of one President Donald Trump. He was invited
to drop a little bit as we get on closer towards the weekend. Friday will be quite a breezy day, fresher air with us for most of us. Temperatures back close to normal. Sunny spells and a few showers moving in across western areas. And the weekend, a lot of bright weather, quite a bit of clouds, some sunny spells and temperatures back to normal, which means more comfortable night's sleep ahead.
The Queen's speech in Westminster, it is dominated by Brexit as the government sets out its agenda for the next 2 years. It was a scaled-back state opening. The Queen arrived by car rather than carriage for the first time since 1974 to deliver the Queen's speech.
My ministers are committed to working with Parliament, the devolved administrations, business and others to build the widest possible consensus on the country's future outside the European Union.
27 bills have been announced. 8 concern Brexit, among the others proposals on terror legislation and domestic violence. Prince Charles accompanied the Queen after the Duke of Edinburgh was admitted to hospital last night for precautionary treatment. Very little pomp and ceremony because of the timing of the state opening, squeezed in before the Queen's engagement at Royal Ascot.
Yeah, get your skates on. First race is 2:30.
Not mentioned in the Queen's speech, Conservative manifesto pledges on social care and grammar schools, and no mention of Donald Trump's planned state visit.
And the other main stories this lunchtime. It could be a record-breaking midsummer's day, with temperatures in parts of the UK expected to hit a 40-year high. And triple Oscar winner Sir Daniel Day-Lewis announces he's retiring from acting after a glittering career.
Coming up in the sport later in the hour on BBC News, after 6 games on tour, some tough choices for Warren Gatland. He's going to name his Lions 15 to face the All Blacks later today.
Good afternoon from Westminster, where the Queen has delivered the government's legislative programme for the next 2 years at the state opening of Parliament.
Thanks, Sophie. The time is just approaching 1:20. Our top story this lunchtime. The government has set out the range of measures it hopes to bring into law over the next 2 years, with Brexit at the top of the agenda. And still to come, Taxi for Travis, the chief executive of Uber, has resigned following months of turmoil at the company.
Coming up in sport later on BBC News, England's cricketers are back in action later today. They're in Southampton, playing the first of 3 2020 matches against South Africa.
The UK could be experiencing its hottest June day for more than 40 years, with temperatures in some parts forecast to soar to 34 degrees later today. Well, the heatwave has seen 5 sizzling days in a row, with temperatures topping 30 degrees since Saturday. Our correspondent Duncan Kennedy reports for us.
May faces, which may well make Maastricht look like a walk in the park.
Norman Smith, thank you. Let's have a look at the weather now with Chris Fawkes. Hot, hot, hot. It certainly is.
Yes, Sophie, indeed. We've already seen temperatures of 31 degrees. It is going to be the hottest day of the year so far. And if we get another 3 degrees Celsius, up to 34, it'll be the hottest June day for 40 years. It's going to be much hotter as well across the Midlands, northeast England, where yesterday it was quite cloudy. Today we've got the sunshine, and that's making the difference. Temperatures will be getting back closer to normal for many areas. However, it'll still be pretty warm and still fairly humid across parts of eastern England, up to 26 degrees in London, so we're still on the warm side. Here's Friday's picture. Bright skies for many of us, a few showers, particularly across northwestern areas, and those temperatures will continue to just fall away a little bit. So closer to average, which means more comfortable nights for getting some decent sleep. The weekend weather prospects, again, a lot of dry and bright weather with some sunny spells coming and going, and those temperatures pretty close to average for the time of year. So, yes, today is going to be the hottest day of the year so far, perhaps the hottest June day for 40 years, but the heat wave is going to end with a bang, with big thunderstorms on the way for some of us. And keep up to date on the temperatures through this afternoon on the BBC Twitter account, @BBC Weather. That's the weather from me, Sophie.
Chris, thank you very much. And that is all from the BBC News at 1 on another big day in Westminster. It is goodbye from me on BBC One. We now join the BBC's news teams where you are. Have a very nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Where people always seem to understand what I do. Japan. I go there a lot and it's a constant source of inspiration.
It gives me a chance to pull together thoughts about history and fiction. Whether historical fiction is legitimate, what it can do that real history can't do.
To understand how we got where we are, we need to go back to the decades from the Victorian age to the First World War, when many of today's attitudes to immigrants were first formed.
The Queen's speech in Westminster dominated by Brexit as the government sets out its agenda for the next 2 years. It was a scaled-back state opening. The Queen arrived by car rather than carriage for the first time since 1974 to deliver the Queen's speech with key messages on terrorism and Brexit.
My ministers are committed to working with Parliament, the devolved administrations, business and others to build the widest possible consensus on the country's future outside the European Union.
27 bills have been announced, 8 concerning Brexit, among the other proposals on terror legislation and domestic violence. Prince Charles accompanied the Queen after the Duke of Edinburgh was admitted to hospital last night for precautionary treatment. Very little pomp and ceremony because of the timing of the state opening squeezed in before the Queen's engagement at Royal Ascot.
Yeah, get your skates on. First race is 2:30.
Not mentioned in the Queen's speech, Conservative manifesto pledges on social care and grammar schools, and no mention of Donald Trump's planned state visit either.
And the other main stories this lunchtime. The survivors of the Grenfell fire disaster will be rehoused in a development in Kensington.
And it's officially the hottest day of the year, with temperatures in parts of the UK expected to hit a 40-year high.
Good afternoon. Welcome to BBC News at 2 o'clock. I'm Simon McCoy, live in Westminster on the day the Queen sets out the government's plans in her speech to Parliament.